We're in the book of Isaiah, and I'm going to pick up like 3 verses at the end of chapter 53. I didn't quite get them Wednesday night, and want to make sure that I hit those texts if I can. So, you can be opening your Bibles to that area, and I'll show you on the screen as well the verses in the text. We're not going to be able to obviously cover into chapter 53 all the way through 59 and hit every verse, but I think I've got it broke down to where we can understand the principles and things that he's teaching. I'm going to stop a couple times in our study and make sure we catch what I might call some interesting moments in the descriptions that he uses there. So let me start by just looking at these last couple of verses here at the very end of chapter 53. These are the last 3 verses of chapter 53. I apologize, I'm not sure why that did. Let me see if I can make that go away. There we go. So remember, he's describing the coming servant, right? He's been talking about the coming of Jesus. He's given lengthy descriptions about the various things that Jesus would fulfill and the way he would be treated. And we've talked about those various things, but we didn't quite finish that description. Notice what it says. Yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him. He hath put him to grief. When thou shalt make his soul an offering for sin, he shall see his seed, he shall prolong his days, and the pleasure of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. He shall see of the travail of his soul, and shall be satisfied. By his knowledge shall my righteous servant justify many, for he shall bear their iniquities. And therefore will I divide him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he hath poured out his soul unto death, and he was numbered with the transgressors, and he bare the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors. And one of the things I think we need to keep reminding ourselves of through this narrative is the fact that this is a contrast, right? They, as the servants of God, failed. As the chosen people of God and His servants, His chosen servants, there were many times where they had failed the purposes that God had intended. They did not fulfill everything that He had asked of them. In fact, they become pretty filled with iniquity and sinful things. The contrast comes when He points to this coming servant, who's Jesus, and He continually reminds them that He will do exactly what the Father asks Him to do. There won't be any variation in His decision making. He will do and fulfill all that's asked, even if it means for Him to be stricken and mocked and scoffed and beaten and ultimately die the death of the cross. The coming servant will honor the purposes that God has set before Him, and that's exactly what Jesus did. But what I want us to notice here, particularly in the latter end of these last few verses that we didn't get to last Wednesday, is that though those are the ways that men would treat Him, He also will be exalted. New Testament writers say He's been given a name that is what? Above all other names, right? Jesus has been given a name. He's been exalted above all others. And why is that? And it's kind of here in the verse. What did He fulfill and accomplish? God's will, and in specific, what's here in this verse that He accomplished? Yeah, and at the very end, he says, and He was numbered with the transgressors, and He bare the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors. It's interesting, right? It's an interesting contrast. The people of God had reached a point in Isaiah's writings where God brought a what against them? Brought judgment, right? This whole book has just been filled with one judgment after another on various entities. Jesus, this coming servant, will be an advocate for the transgressor. He will be one who will aid and benefit and provide answer to sins for the iniquities of the people, that they might find remedy and answer so they don't have to see that consequential judgment that God has for those who choose to dishonor Him. They can turn from that and repent, which we'll see in the next chapter, and benefit can come despite. Jesus accomplishes the full purpose of God when He dies upon the cross, and He provides the answer to transgression that could not be understood or seen prior to that. And that was a piece of that whole picture of that coming servant that I just didn't get to, that I wanted to make sure I at least talked about for a minute this evening. Any thoughts or questions you had about that latter end of chapter 53? Okay, so let's keep moving through the narrative then. In chapter 54, at the outset of the chapter, he talks about this barren and desolate nation, and that how they will ultimately have an opportunity for restoration. Notice verse 1 of the text. Sing, O barren, thou that didst not bear, break forth into singing. You were once barren, desolate, could not provide for yourselves, but bring forth the praises of God, because an answer is coming to those challenges. And the reason for that is God's anger was temporary. What I appreciate about this text is it reminds us that though there are moments where God's wrath and anger and His vindication are necessary and perfectly suited even within His righteousness, God doesn't stay angry forever. His anger generally is temporary, and it's often tempered by various circumstances and things. Notice verse 7 of chapter 54. For a small moment have I forsaken thee. God says, I brought judgment against you because you chose to do all kinds of things that I would have preferred you not, obviously, but that was just a moment. For a moment I've forsaken thee, but with great mercies will I gather thee. In a little wrath I hid my face from thee for a moment, but with everlasting kindness will I have mercy on thee, saith the Lord thy Redeemer. And I've always felt these moments within Isaiah's narrative here probably have kind of twofold implications. You've got the immediate understanding that his people would have grasped as they're coming out of captivity, and He's going to restore them as a nation of people for a period of time. He's going to allow them to come back into the promised land. He's going to allow them to rebuild Jerusalem to an extent. He's going to allow them to rebuild a temple, though not as grand as what Solomon had built. He's going to allow them to reestablish their worship and service to Him. And he wants them to appreciate that all of those things that He had to bring in judgment against them were temporary, and if you remember the rest of the prophecy, because He still needs them, according to His covenant promise. He's not gotten to Jesus yet. The coming servant hasn't arrived yet. This is the people He's coming through, irregardless in some senses of anything else. And so judgment came, then the mercies, the kindnesses that He wanted to extend. But you could also, twofold, you could also look at that as who coming? Who's the ultimate Redeemer? Jesus is, right? That's this picture that Isaiah keeps intertwining. And it's kind of, I don't want to say tricky, but he's sometimes very specifically talking about Jesus' arrival, and sometimes he's talking about God's purposes that kind of have both meanings. It has a specific and immediate meaning to the contemporaries of Isaiah, but it also is language that points to what Jesus would accomplish ultimately when He arrived. But what I loved about the imagery here is that God's anger is temporary. For a moment, I needed to deal with you, He said, but restoration can come. And the hope and mercies and promises that God extends was available to them. And ultimately, His covenant's going to be honored. Again, who was that covenant originally made to? Abraham, right? We talked about that Sunday morning. Originally, the promise was made to Abraham. He's going to honor it. Through thy seed, great things are going to happen. You're going to become innumerable, Abraham, as descendants go. But ultimately, one will come from you that will bring great and long-lasting benefit. And mentions, interestingly, in verse 13, that all thy children shall be taught of the Lord, and great shall be the peace of thy children. In Acts chapter 2, if you flipped over there real quick in verses 17 and 18, you'd notice that's that text where where they're reminded of the prophecies, right? Your sons and your daughters will what? Will prophesy. Your young men and your maidens, they'll begin to have knowledge and appreciation. I think Acts 2 is really kind of talking about the moments in which Isaiah is pointing to here, when ultimately the generations that will come are going to benefit from the redemption and the power of God and the mercies that He extends, and by His willingness to honor the covenant, even though did they deserve for that covenant to be honored? And why is that, by the way? And I'm not trying to trick you. It's a simple answer. Yeah, that's right. They broke the covenant. God didn't just arbitrarily decide He didn't want to use them anymore or He wanted to punish them. They broke the covenant. They broke the agreement and the promises and the connectivity they had with God the Father through their decision making. And God says, I'm going to honor it. I disciplined you for a period of time. My anger was momentary and temporary, but I'm going to restore you. And the Redeemer will ultimately come. I'm going to honor the covenant of promise that I've made. Any thoughts or things that you saw in that text that I did not talk about? Well, notice verse 17 and God's protection over them. I like the language. No weapon that is formed against thee shall prosper, and every tongue that shall rise against thee in judgment thou shalt condemn. This is the heritage of the servants of the Lord, and their righteousness is of me, saith the Lord. It's tricky a little bit, right? Because will they face physical enemies again? Yeah, right? Ultimately, they're going to face the oppression of what nation? Rome, right? They're going to feel the thumb and challenges of Rome eventually in this process. So when he talks about this idea that no weapon that is formed against thee shall prosper, and every tongue that shall rise against thee in judgment thou shalt condemn, I think he's pointing more to that concept in the Roman letter in Romans 8, verse 35, when who shall separate you from the love of God? Right? Can anything really pull you away? Can the weapons of warfare take you away from God? No. Can the challenges that come to mankind really do any true harm to you? The answer to that is no. Because they're going to face other real, live, physical enemies. But those enemies can't prevail ultimately in the full benefit that God intends, because that's fulfilled in Jesus and His kingdom that can't be touched by these things. I think he's got a spiritual mindset here. And he's talking about that coming spiritual kingdom, that they'll be able to withstand the challenges that come. Jump to chapter 55. So, at the beginning of the chapter, we learn that God will sustain those who seek what is truly valuable. And just read with me. Everyone that thirsteth, come ye to the waters. And he that hath no money, come ye, buy and eat. Yea, come buy wine and milk without money and without price. Wherefore do ye spend money for that which is not bread, and your labor for that which satisfieth not? Hearken diligently unto me, and eat ye that which is good, and let your soul delight itself in fatness. Incline your ear and come unto me. Hear, and your soul shall live, and I will make an everlasting covenant with you, even the sure mercies of David. In Matthew chapter 5 and verse 6, that's part of the what, by the way? That's the Beatitudes, right? That's Beatitudes. And in verse 6 he says, blessed are they who hunger and thirst after righteousness. That's what he's talking about here. Those who adopt that spirit, the hungering and thirsting after righteousness, you don't have to worry about having money to do that. You don't have to worry about those resources running out. Those who pursue the righteousness and good, those who pursue that which is truly valuable will benefit from it. Look at John 4, verse 14. I don't think I put it in the chart and meant to, but look at it real quick with me. John 4 in verse 14, and notice this in connection to this promise that's being made within the prophecy. But notice he said, but whoever drinks of the water, this is Jesus speaking, but whoever drinks of the water that I shall give him will never thirst. But the water that I shall give him will become in him a fountain of water springing up into everlasting life. That's the imagery the Isaiah, the prophet's writing about, that ultimately is fulfilled in Jesus. Waters that are offered freely. You don't have to work in the sense of labor in order to receive it. You don't have to have money in order to get it. It's a provision that God is offering to any that will come and listen and be moved by the righteousness that is found in Him.
Those things are nourishment for the soul.
Yeah, and they certainly help, and they are restorative continually, and aid and benefit in strengthening the faithful if they'll give themselves and incline themselves to it. And then there's this series, what I'm going to simply label them as valuable lessons in chapter 55, beginning in verse 6. And I'm taking them in order if you're reading out of the text. But notice the first one. He said, seek ye the Lord while he may be found. Call ye upon him while he is near. What do you think he means by that? So what's didn't mean anything? Okay. So the opportunities to seek the Lord are limited. They're limited. You or I won't have forever to make the decisions about what we want to do with the Lord. Seek ye the Lord while he may be found. It's an interesting contrast, right? Because when he was bringing his judgment against his people, he couldn't be what? He couldn't be found. They had reached a point where his judgment against them was coming with great force, and there was no turning him. He was unapproachable for them for a period of time because of their transgressions and decisions. And so when they come out of this, when they come out of the captivity, when they begin to see this coming, all of this history that's going to eventually unfold, recognize the importance of seeking the Lord while we have opportunity. And that hasn't changed. That truth is still as valuable, should be just as valuable to us as it was to them. Notice the second one. Let the wicked forsake his way, and the unrighteous man his thoughts, and let him return unto the Lord. Again, a message that can work in either time. But the importance of leaving unrighteousness in order that we might what? Yeah, to pursue the Lord. We've talked before in the past that it's kind of hard to do both, isn't it? It's hard to give yourself over to unrighteousness and seek the Lord simultaneously. And there's a reason for that, because the Lord can't be sought in that way. And what we need to recognize is, let's forsake and let go of the wickedness and iniquities first, and then we can pursue the Lord in the proper ways. And then there's that familiar phrase. We've used it a lot, I'm sure, in various times, but he says, for my thoughts are not what? Yeah, my thoughts are not your thoughts. Neither are your ways my ways, saith the Lord. Right. And I think we sometimes try to we make that mistake. And our job is to conform to His will instead of trying to transform His will into something that's more palatable to us. And that's an important concept. What else do you see in this thought?
You don't have to worry about that.
Okay, yeah, you see this idea that God says, listen, just follow my ways, right? I've got the paths, I've got the understanding that you need, if that's what you're pointing at, and trust it, right? Trust that path. And I think that's key. Do I have to understand why God said something or why He wants me to do something in order to follow it? No. But often, when we don't understand it or we're challenged by it, we make the mistake of doing what? Yeah, questioning it. Sometimes what happens is well, why would God want me to do that? Or why is He withholding that from me? Or why is He telling me I'm not supposed to behave in that way? And what happens is we convince ourselves my thoughts are better than His thoughts, and we begin to question why it is God has outlined certain things in the way that He has. So God wants them to understand. God thinks in ways that you and I are incapable of. God sees things in ways that you and I are incapable of. Generally speaking, we see the things that are right where? I'm trying to give it to you. Right in front of us, right? Things that are right in front of us. That's kind of what we see and focus our attention on. And I don't necessarily say that to anyone's fault. What I want us to appreciate is that God can see well beyond the moment. My thoughts are not your thoughts. My ways are not your ways. And the reason for that is He's got superior understanding. While we're still concentrating on the step that I'm about to take, He already knows what the 10th one is. He already knows what lies out there ahead of me. And so if He has a grasp and an understanding of what lies ahead of me, I should trust Him. He's the one that has that understanding, not me. I don't understand those things, but He does. I need to trust Him more, place more confidence in Him, because His thoughts and my thoughts, unworthy to be held in the same conversation because of His grasp and understanding of things.
When I think of that verse, I think of the conversation that Job had with God. And Job was questioning, and God said, where were you when I created the earth?
Yeah. I've always loved that account of Job because I kind of like the way God responds to him. He says, okay, you want an answer? I'm going to answer you in a whirlwind. and then he comes down with those pretty stern, comments. And that's the confidence we need to have in God. Go ahead, Amy.
I was just going to say, didn't we just study this in Proverbs?
Yeah.
I'm looking for which one it was, but
Yeah, there are similar, and I'd have to take a minute to think about it too, but there are some similar connections. Anybody else have a thought? Go ahead, Doug.
Don't feel bad because the disciples, He was there with them.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing.
Yeah.
He told them many times,
Yeah.
just trust and do what I tell you.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's an interesting contrast, right? Here's the prophet telling us, but those ultimate disciples, immediate disciples, who had the greatest opportunity and connectivity, still often question Jesus. Why don't we do it this way or that way? And the weaknesses that they expressed as well. Go ahead, Bill.
Back in the earlier part of this chapter, it said, without money, without price. No, it doesn't cost us dollars and cents.
Right.
But it does cost us time, maybe effort, discipline.
Yeah.
Sometimes we use the phrase that buy in.
Yeah.
You take some of these kids that are deciding now whether they're going to play college football. Some of these coaches are really difficult, hard to play for, but they're successful. And the kids buy into that, and they've got to put a lot of effort into it. Yeah. And when they do that, they're successful. So same's true when we put in the time and the effort. We can be successful by doing things Jesus' way.
Sure. And I think what we have to remind ourselves of is, you're right, it's not costing us monetary things, but there is a cost. There is a cost to discipleship, and the cost is me. Time, energy, effort, faith, commitment, all those things is the price we pay to honor God. And then he continued that, what I'm calling valuable lessons. He said, for as the rain cometh down and the snow from heaven, and returneth not thither, but watereth the earth, and maketh it bring forth and bud, that it may give seed to the sower and bread to the eater, so shall my word be that goeth forth out of my mouth. It shall not return unto me void, but it shall accomplish that which I please, and it shall prosper in the thing whereto I sent it. Quick question. Have you ever said anything that was worthless? Yeah, right. Yeah, we stating the obvious. Now, I'm not saying profane. I didn't say profane or things like that. But we've all probably said something that didn't have much purpose or meaning behind it. Never happens with God. Never happens with Him. There's not a single word that proceeds from God that doesn't have purpose. And nothing that He says ever returns to Him void. I always go back when I think about the voice of God, and I think about His message, and I think about the power of that. I always try to remind myself that that is the first imagery of Him that we have, right? In the book of Genesis, in Genesis chapter 1, God said, let there be light, and there was light. The words of God never return to Him void. Can man reject them? Yes, I can make a choice and decision. He gives me free will. He allows for me to make a decision about what I will do in relationship to His message. But my personal decision in relationship to what God says has no bearing whatsoever on whether His actual message had emptiness or had no real value to it. It always has value. And when God speaks, never comes back to Him void. It's just like the water that might have taken a while, right? It hits the mountaintop, it flows down the stream, and it ends up eventually to the roots of a tree somewhere that then allows it to grow and to bear fruit. It may be a process, but ultimately it has the benefit that God intended. Go ahead, Ken.
To go along with the example you gave, man may reject creation, but God said, let there be light, and it still accomplished what it wanted to, even though there's a large portion of men that today reject that, the things recorded for us.
It is sad that here you've got this powerful message, right? And yet men, for whatever reason, show disinterest. So let's look at chapter 56. And what I love about the beginning of chapter 56 is he gives this idea and education about how God will embrace anyone who'll come to Him. God, anybody that comes to God, He'll welcome. Notice the language. Neither let the son of the stranger that hath joined himself to the Lord speak, saying, the Lord hath utterly separated me from His people. Neither let the eunuch say, behold, I am a dry tree. For thus saith the Lord unto the eunuchs that keep my Sabbaths, and choose the things that please me, and take hold of my covenant. God says, listen, you may feel like you don't have what? Any importance or a purpose or value. Think about it. And I'm not trying to be humorous here. I'm being literal here. If the promises of this covenant that originally made from Abraham, still flowing through the people, is about ultimately his seed, his descendants, arriving at this great coming servant, what's a eunuch think to himself? I don't have any part of that. I can't even be part of that. And God says, tell the eunuch don't think that way. Just because he may not be the father of the father of the father of the father that ultimately brings us Jesus, you still have purpose, you still have value. It's interesting. And then he tells the foreigner or the stranger, you may think that you're less valuable to God because you weren't born into the Jewish family. Maybe you proselyted into the nation. Or fast forward into the days of Jesus, you came out of where? Generically. You're not Jew, but Gentile, right? You're the stranger. You're the foreigner. You came out of the Gentile community, not the Jewish community. I'm going to treat you with the same value. If you'll embrace me, God says, I'll embrace you. Even when you don't feel like you have a whole lot you can bring to the table. It's a great message that Isaiah is putting forth to his contemporaries, but I think he's pointing especially to that time in which Jesus would come. And Jesus will value everybody, irregardless of where they come from, what their self-worth in their eyes is. He'll find a place. And it's a great messaging in the text. Go ahead, Mike.
But that's totally against what the Jewish rabbis believe, that you have to have strict bloodline to be a Jew.
Yeah, and I think you're right. And Mike, even the contemporaries of Jesus kind of were obviously resistant. In fact, even Peter, the apostle, was resistant to a little bit of that. And Paul had to come and say, hey, listen, the Gentiles have been grafted in. You need to embrace them as equal. But it took a while. Yeah. Right. And that value system was always interesting, wasn't it? To see how they were trying to determine those things. And he gets a little negative at the end of chapter 56. And it's not a new theme. We've seen this over and over and over again throughout the prophecy. But he speaks again about this irresponsible leadership that they'd had, that had not guided them very wisely. In fact, at the end there, verse 12, he says, "Come ye, say they, I will fetch wine, and we will fill ourselves with strong drink, and tomorrow shall be as this day, and much more abundant." There were still folks among them that were convinced that it didn't matter what they did. The consequences and judgments of God still would not touch them. And he continually throughout the prophecy, for whatever reasons, in various moments, Isaiah keeps coming back and reminding them of the judgments and consequences they had brought to themselves. Go to chapter 57. Because there's a sad outcome that came from their behaviors. And notice, the righteous perisheth, and no one what? Yeah. No man layeth it to the heart. We would say no one cares. No one cares. The righteous are perishing, and among the people, no one cared. Merciful men are taken away, none considering that the righteous is taken away from the evil to come. My ways are not your ways, your thoughts are not my thoughts. It's interesting, right? Because think about some of those exiles and some of those that were taken captive. So, along with them were some of the righteous faithful. And he says, don't forget that might have been purposeful. I might have done that on purpose. You don't know, basically saying. But it's sad to see when the righteous are suffering, having to suffer right along because of the consequences of the unrighteous, and it doesn't seem to bother anybody. That they're dragging their wickedness, and they're just dragging everybody right along into it and the challenges without concern at all. So that would be pretty disheartening. So he comes back and later in the text and says, but listen, there's still comfort and peace to the remnant. And he reminds them there is a true result of wickedness. Notice verse 20. But the wicked are like the troubled sea when it cannot rest, whose waters cast up mire and dirt. There is no peace, saith my God, to the wicked. Any sense of peace that the unrighteous or the wicked have is what kind? False. It's false. And at best it's temporary. And God wants them to recognize that. He wants them to know and to see that because temptation is, if you convince that the wicked are prospering, the temptation is to do what? Be like them. Follow it, right? Follow it. If they seem to be having all the success and everything seems to be going there, the temptation is, I might as well dive in to that as well. God's reminding them that they don't have what they appear to have, and they don't have the full benefit and value of what the remnant can experience if they will remain faithful to the Lord. Let me jump you to chapter 58. Because chapter 58, and I'll not get to 59 tonight, but that's all right. It's an interesting chapter. I want to take our last 4 or 5 minutes here and talk a little bit about it. Because really the whole chapter is about one subject, and it's about their fasting efforts. And it's interesting because their fasting had become about them. And it created for them a false sense of proving themselves to God. Well, anyway, you'll see it. Let me just share some of the narrative with you. So notice the first 3 verses. Cry aloud, spare not. Lift up thy voice like a trumpet, and show my people their transgression, and the house of Jacob their sins. Yet they seek me daily, and delight to know my ways, as a nation that did righteousness, and forsook not the ordinance of their God. They ask of me the ordinances of justice. They take delight in approaching to God. Wherefore have we fasted, say thee, and thou seest not? Wherefore have we afflicted our soul, and thou takest no knowledge? Behold, in the day of your fast ye find pleasure, and exact all. So the picture is, they've been restrictive, and they've been fasting, and they've been doing all these things, and yet God still judged them. And their response to that is, why? Why are you judging us, Lord? Didn't you see our fast? Didn't you see our interest in, didn't you see the way that we tried to approach and afflict ourselves and create pride? Didn't you witness all of those things? Notice verse 4. Is it such a fast that I have chosen? That's what God's asking them. You chose what you wanted to do and then expected me to honor it and look at it as making you have a greater connection to me. A day for a man to afflict his soul? Is it to bow down his head as a bulrush and to spread sackcloth and ashes under him? Wilt thou call this a fast and an acceptable day to the Lord? It's pretty powerful language, isn't it? So you afflict yourself for a little while. You kind of walk with your head down, and you try to show this facade of piety towards God, and you really call that a fast? Then watch this. Is not this the fast that I have chosen? That's not what I wanted. This is what I wanted. To loose the bands of wickedness, to undo the heavy burdens, and to let the oppressed go free, and that ye break every yoke. It is not to deal thy bread to the hungry. Is it not, rather, to deal thy bread to the hungry, and that thou bring the poor that are cast out up to thy house? When thou seest the naked, that thou cover him, and that thou hide not thyself from thine own flesh. God says, you want to bring forth the fast I want? Quit feeling like, and I'm going to say this, and I apologize, I really wanted 15 minutes on this tonight. Your faith to God and your Christianity is more than what happens inside these 4 walls. And we've got to remember that. We have mistakenly at times, in my humble estimation and just my observations over the years, it's not, we're not doing we're not fasting, we're not restricting food, and we're not walking around with our heads down like bulrushes, and we don't, but what we do sometimes is we almost give the impression that this is the place where real religious piety is shown. When we come into this is the place where real religion is demonstrated. And God said, no, it's not. Is it important? Yes. Is it required of God? Yes. Is it where? Go ahead, Gary. I know that's right. It's what we do outside of these walls that God is more in tune to when it comes to really evaluating His servants. Not just whether they perform some act of worship, because they did that. They repeatedly did that. And then were confused when God said, you didn't do what I chose. I didn't ask you to do that. What I asked you to do was to feed the hungry. What I asked you to do is to quit laying heavy burdens on people that they can't bear. What I asked you to do was when somebody needed a shelter over their head, bring them into your house. What I asked you to do, a true fast to the Lord, was be a servant to others. And I don't know why that, for some reason in my personal studies of that, today in particular, that rushed at me strong. that we sometimes view what equates to faithfulness in odd ways. And we sometimes, as they did, miss what God really values. And that's not to say we neglect other things that are important, but it is to say that be careful that we don't convince ourselves that this is the only place that real piety and religious fervor are demonstrated to God. In fact, I would argue out of this text, through their example, that God said it has more to do with what happens out there in the way we conduct ourselves and behave and address others. At least it did with them, and I think that's pretty easily understood out of this text. I thought it was a good lesson. I apologize. Maybe I'll give it 5 minutes, Lord willing, next week, and then you'll just have to guess as to what the rest of the book's about, because I'll run out of time.